So today we're only looking at half of book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics. And why is that? If you've read ahead, you realize that the second half of the book actually starts going off in a different direction, right? It starts talking about specific virtues and vices, those concerned with courage, those concerned with temperance, and we're going to examine those separately in another class session where we have other virtues and vices in book 4. So today we're looking at this section that's really self-contained. It has to do with certain key ideas. What's voluntary or what's chosen? And another way of thinking about this is, what are we actually responsible for as human beings? You know, if you think about, again, it's often helpful to compare us to other kinds of beings. You know, if I drop this pen, is it choosing to fall? Is there any voluntariness about that whatsoever? It's under sort of an external compulsion. The earth is attracting it. That's it. There's nothing more to the story. I mean, you could say, well, it's made of matter and all that, but you know, we're kind of taking that for granted. Plants, you know, what do plants do with sunlight? Most plants, at least. Say again? They absorb it, and it's part of their process of photosynthesis, right? They grow. Does a plant say, now today I need to photosynthesize, better put it on my to-do list? You know, it's part of its nature. It just automatically does that, right? And we have things like that in us. Do any of you have to think right now about breathing? If you do, you're probably going to die. If you get to the point where you have to tell yourself, okay, take a breath, take another one, that's it. You're done. Because, you know, between that and then once you have to start thinking about, okay, beat that heart, make the heart beat, you'll never get around to things like digestion, you know, or other processes that you need in your thing. We have these automatic nervous responses, they call these, right? Part of the autonomic nervous system, I think it's called. Are you responsible for that? I mean, if you breathe a little fast from time to time, if you have high blood pressure, I mean, you could say you're responsible for high blood pressure in a way, couldn't you? I mean, like, for instance, I once got diagnosed, not exactly diagnosed, that's the wrong word. My doctor was concerned because you know, they always check you for high blood pressure as soon as you come in. And that particular day I was sick. I drank 2 pots of coffee and I hadn't eaten anything all day long. And I had to drive across town to get there, and there was a train, and I was going to be late, and I don't like being late, so my heart is kind of, you know, getting more and more agitated. So I get in there, and I was like 140 over 90, which is, you know, a little high. And now once you're on the radar, now you're supposed to get checked. And I told them, there's reasons why my blood pressure is high, this is anomalous, and they said, well, sorry, we have our protocols, we have to check this. So every day for a week, my aunt, who I lived next to at the time, who was a nurse, she would check my blood pressure, and sure enough, it was 120 over 80 like normal, and then the doctor said, okay. Now, what if I was the kind of person who was always eating Twinkies? You know, in addition to drinking 2 pots of coffee a day, which I probably shouldn't do. Would I be more responsible for my high blood pressure? Or what if I was the kind of person who was always surfing the internet for stuff that ticked me off? Do you know any people like that? No? I do. And they often tend to be a little on edge, don't they? Then I would be somewhat responsible for my blood pressure. But for the most part, we're not, right? And you could have gotten the good genes in the gene lottery, or you could have gotten bad genes. So some of you may have a tendency towards diabetes, some of you may not. In my adopted family, on my mom's side, they all tend to keep their teeth until old age, and they all tend to live into their 80s and 90s. But so that's good, right? There's also a lot of bipolar disorder in the family as well. Not so good. If you are born into a family where your genes dictate these sorts of things, are you responsible for them? Are you responsible for being as tall as you are? No. I guess, you know, since you didn't like start smoking cigarettes when you were 8, you know, and stunt your growth, in a sense you're responsible for not being shorter. But yeah, you're tall, I'm tall. Is anybody responsible for being shorter than you? No. I mean, did you have a choice? Did you say, I'd like to add another 4 inches to my height, and I don't want to wear, like, you know, shoes to do that or anything. I'll put myself on the rack and stretch myself. Is that the sort of thing that we can actually do? You're born with the body you're born with the propensities that you have, and those are not within your power. Now think about animals. So we get away from all this vegetative stuff. Now things start to get a little bit more voluntary. We hold animals responsible for some of the things they do, at least certain animals. Do we hold ants responsible for anything? They're basically just like little protein robots. Everything's hardwired for them. They don't have a lot of learning responses. Bees can learn things, actually, it turns out. Not much, but you know, it's mostly honey-related things or nectar-related things. But they can learn a little bit. What about your dog or your cat? You ever consider your dog or your cat responsible for things? Let's say, here's a common example. You have a cat, you don't change the litter for a week, or you have a dog and you keep the dog inside all day, all night. What's a likely result? They're going to make a mess somewhere, right? And you're not going to be happy about it. But, and you may yell at them, bad dog, right? And put his nose in that. But is the dog responsible for that if you didn't let the dog out? Or the cat if you didn't clean the cat litter? Cats get angry about that after a while, right? They actually show their anger. Now what if you actually do let the dog in and out, and you do clean the cat litter, and the cat, you know, still like looking right at you, and goes over and say, pees right on your back. Now would you start to think it's a bit more responsible? Or, you know, you have a dog and a cat, right? Is it in the dog's nature to necessarily attack the cat? Does the dog have to? They're raised together, say as puppy and kitten, right? And some days the dog does it, some days the dog doesn't. Some days the dog just wants to mess with the cat, other days it doesn't. You hold the dog responsible, don't you? You say, bad dog. You're saying that it's voluntary in some respect. The dog, on some level, can choose. Now, the dog has certain feelings. It likes going after the cat. But are we necessarily dominated by our feelings? Do we have to follow them? That's where we get to a higher level, right? What about us? We have way more within our control, don't we, than a dog. Because a dog, think of certain things. Can I put food in front of you and tell you don't eat it and walk out of the room and come back, 20 minutes later and you'll have left the food there? Sometimes. I could, offer you reasons why to do it, right? I want to test you. This is part of an experiment. So, okay. I'll hold off. Will that work with a dog? Probably not. I've never seen a dog that would work. 20 minutes? That's like a lifetime for a dog, isn't it? When food is in front of it. Sooner or later that dog is going to eat that food. There are certain capacities of its nature that are just exhausted by that point. Whereas we have a lot more control, don't we? And this is where we get to this issue of virtues and vices and choices and deliberation. Why are we interested in all this talk about responsibility and choice? Well, in part because we're doing virtue ethics. And virtue ethics, virtues and vices, remember the definition that we have, they're not just habits, they're concerned with choice. So if somebody is generous, and they have a character trait of being generous, they're not just generous once in a while, but they're generous typically with you as a friend or a family member, or even just an acquaintance at work, somebody who's in your workplace. Do you praise them for that? Do you consider that to be a good thing? Would you consider it to be a good thing if you found out that they didn't really have a choice in it? That there was something hardwired in their brain that just made them that way? Or that somebody else was like making them do that somehow? Or that they didn't really realize, you thought they were being generous, and they didn't really realize how much things cost. So they're paying money for, whatever, buying you donuts or taking you out for lunch or something like that, and they get to the end of the month and like, whoa, I've got no money left. Would you consider them to be virtuous? Would you consider them to be generous? Or would you say they were acting in a nice way, but they didn't really know what they were doing? Yeah.
Maybe acting in a nice way and not really know what they're doing. Because like sometimes you get yourself into something that you want to do, but you don't realize that you don't have, not the potential, but like the means of fulfilling it.
Yeah. What if we go to the other, one sec. Oh, go ahead.
That's what I was going to say. Like if you were to say, because there are some people who can't like filter themselves. Like they can't filter what they're saying, and you might think they're being a mean person, but they can't control it. And
or you might think they're being honest with
yeah,
it.
and like, do you think they're bad? They're a bad person because they're saying what any normal person might be thinking, but they just can't control it?
That's a good example. Yeah, actually, that's Aristotle doesn't talk about that, but that's a good one to think about. What do we call that? We talk about them not having a filter, not having an internal censor, right? You're right. Some people don't. What about if we go the other way and we take a stingy person, somebody who is always, holding on to their money. They're placed in situations where they could be generous. They pass it up. Once they become a parent, they're going to, not buy anything for their kids other than, bare necessities. Do you think of that as something chosen on some level? Could they be different? Yeah.
I think it's chosen on some level. Like, I know my older brother, when he was younger, like, not younger, but my age,
Yeah.
he was really stingy with his money and would not buy anything. And the only thing he'd spend his money on was going on vacation once a year. That was
Okay.
it. Nothing else. Bare minimum. If, like, anyone asked him for money, it was no, he doesn't have any. Now he has more money to save than, like, my parents do. And he's only 27. Like, he
Yeah.
saved so much that, like, from being stingy, that was his own decision.
Yeah.
To not go out and spend, like,
Has he changed at all? Has he become more generous with it now? Or is he
a little bit,
is he laid down in that
like
pattern?
little by little, he realizes like what he does have versus like what some other people don't have. So, but that's his
But he's
choice.
still more on the stingy side then.
Yeah, oh yeah.
It's interesting that you say that he realizes there's sort of a process of getting a better perspective, right? In order for somebody to change from being vicious to being virtuous, very often that requires some sort of change in perspective. In part because the vicious person actually sees things wrongly. That's part of what makes them vicious. That's what holds them in the habit. And again, if the person didn't have any control over that, let's say there was something hardwired in their brain that just made them stingy, and there was nothing they could do about it, would we consider them to be the kind of, would we look at them as a bad person the way that we look at the person who chooses to be stingy, who could do otherwise, but passes up the opportunities to do that? I don't think so. Aristotle's talking about something that fits in with our normal understanding of moral realities. Now, choice fits into, for Aristotle, when he's using the word choice, he doesn't mean every single choice that we make. He means the choices that actually form our character. Sometimes it's translated as deliberative choice. I like to translate it as character-forming choice. This word that he's using is a Greek word, proiresis, which literally means to place one thing above or in front of another. So in the case of somebody who sees going on vacation as the best thing, he makes choices over and over again not to give to other people so that he can save up for vacation, right? Or actually, in this case, not just save up for vacation, but save up, period. So he sees saving as better than other things. He prefers, you might say, saving to personal relationships and being generous. And we can talk about this in all different contexts. You can say somebody prefers one physical good over another. Somebody prefers a relationship over another type of relationship. Somebody prefers it being a certain way over another way. If I decide, as I had to eventually in my life, I don't want to be quite such an angry person, not just angry in the sense of having the emotion, but not managing it well, I had to make a choice. What am I going to sacrifice, say, indulging myself, getting to feel justified all the time? I had to choose something else, better personal relationships. Every one of you has made a big choice that landed you here at Marist College. You chose to go to college with all the other things that that entails and all the work that you guys are doing over taking it easy. And you know some people who haven't made that choice, right? Or who made that choice and didn't follow through on that choice. And we would say that you're responsible for that. Now, there's a broader category of the voluntary. What is in our control? What is it that we are responsible for? And the choices that frame our characters fit into that. But this notion of the voluntary is a bit broader. So we want to think about what makes an action or even an emotional reaction voluntary. Brought up this idea about, automatic things. Are you responsible for your heartbeat? No. When you become responsible for your breathing and it becomes voluntary, like I said, you're in deep trouble. There are some things, digestion, that better keep going on whether you think about it or not, right? But there's a lot of other things that are voluntary. For example, look around the room. Is anybody wearing the same outfit as anybody else? You could be. You could all be wearing Marist spirit wear, right? Or everybody could be dressed in olive green and blue. Why not? We could do that, couldn't we? I could come in with that too, Dr. Sadler's uniform for class. Everyone would look at us kind of funny, but, maybe there'd be some benefit to that. Who knows? You had a choice about what you put on, right? You thought, maybe you didn't think about it. Maybe you just grabbed the first things you could. But, maybe some of you actually planned out what you were going to wear. Things that you're wearing here, would you necessarily wear them everywhere? No? Like if you were actually going to play on a sports team, probably should wear that uniform, right? Because otherwise nobody's going to know what team you're on. Some of the stuff that you're wearing here, I suppose, could be business casual. If you were going to be in an office and you were like an executive, would you wear what you're wearing here? Any of it? Unless maybe you're in advertising. What would you wear? For the guys, it's easy, right? High-powered executive, not just shirt and tie, right? Suit, yeah. Not just any suit. You're not going to wear like the striped seersucker summer suit, because you're not, playing at a Chautauqua. You're going to wear like the pinstripe, with a nice power tie. Women, it's a little bit more complicated, isn't it? What exactly you ought to wear in the workplace. They actually offer classes on this, by the way. Up at the Culinary, they have a short seminar on what exactly is appropriate business attire, because it's so hard to figure out exactly what you ought to wear, isn't it? At what level? What's business casual? What's, totally informal? What's like high-powered, corporate fashion, all those sorts of things. It's kind of hard to tell. For men, it's really easy, thank God, because otherwise it would drive me nuts. I have, fairly limited choices. I either wear a suit, or I wear a jacket and tie, or I wear a sweater, or if I want to be, casual, like on days like this, just wear a flannel shirt. Okay? That's all within our choice. Could somebody make you wear a particular thing? Could they compel you to do so? Certain circumstances, I think you'd say that. Here'd be a prime example. If you're in prison, do you get to wear anything you like? How about a guard's uniform? You get to wear one of those? You You put on one of those and you're in deep trouble, right? Even if you're like wearing other stuff, you might get yourself in considerable trouble. You have to wear what they issue you. And it's interesting because different states have different garb, but one of the things that they do nowadays, because they learn from experience, uniformly do, if a prisoner is being transported, what colors are they usually wearing? Orange, sometimes yellow too. And they usually have to wear like a jumpsuit, coveralls in that color. So you can identify them. Do they have a choice? Do they get, in a sense, they could say, screw you, I'm not going to wear it. But then there's an awful lot of consequences, aren't there? So it's much less voluntary. And this brings us to the question of what makes something voluntary. What are you or other people responsible for? What do you actually choose? What would you say makes something voluntary? What do you hold other people responsible for? Or yourself? When do you actually feel good or bad about the things that you're doing? Yeah. Go ahead, you had a thought. We can work with it.
I guess, is it following manners, I guess?
Following manners, okay. You mean like when you're in a situation, doing what the situation calls for? Or? Okay, that's an example of something that is voluntary. You're right. Could there be cases where you screw up in that way, but you didn't mean to? Well, what would those cases be like? Has that ever happened to any of you? Where you made what they call a faux pas, false step? Never? I made plenty. I still make some. You put me in front of like a really fancy dinner set, and I know that you start from the outside with the forks, so I've got that part down. So, but I'm, a thrifty Midwesterner, so I tend to keep my fork. And you're not supposed to do that, right? That's a faux pas. I suppose I could stop doing that. I do it sort of out of habit. At one time I did it because I didn't know any better. Right? I didn't know it. I pick whatever fork is going to work, right? You get different spoons. I don't know which spoon goes to what. You have that little tiny fork that apparently is for seafood. I'm not sure how you're supposed to use it. One of the things that could stand in the way of whether something is voluntary is it's ignorance. So when we say that something is voluntary, we often say, well, it's not done from ignorance. If the person is actually ignorant, in some sense, we're willing to say, oh, they didn't know. They're not responsible, right? What else, though? I mean, that's a negative condition. Yeah?
Ignorance, wouldn't there be some situations where you should expect to put everything down?
Yeah, and we're going to get into that in just a moment. Yeah.
I haven't described this, but they don't, or they do it knowing they know, or they have the option to do the opposite.
So they're conscious of the range of possibilities? Yeah. Again, that could fall, they're not being done from ignorance, knowing what your actual... Because sometimes people do things, and they don't realize they could have done something different, right? I think that's a kind of ignorance that Aristotle doesn't talk about, but in our society, we spend a lot of time focusing on. We talk about the need to empower people through knowledge, right? And that would fit in with what you're talking about, where at a certain point we say, hey, you were given the information, you're responsible. The fact that you say you don't know this, you should know it, right? There are conditions like that. And we're going to get into those in just a moment. What else? When we say somebody's responsible, what else do we mean? Yeah.
Well, what makes something voluntary is that based on if you can rationalize or reason, like, the decision.
So you can provide some reasonable explanation. Because not any explanation will do, right? If I ask you, why did you wear that shirt, and you say, well, I was playing cards last night, and I happened to win $30 at poker. I say, what the hell does that have to do with wearing a shirt? I don't, that's not a reasonable explanation yet. He said, well, it was my lucky shirt, and I'm going to play poker again today. So, and now it actually starts to make sense. Yeah, I think that is a component of it. Aristotle, again, doesn't focus on that so much, but that's a good point as well. What he really focuses on is the action has its origin in the acting person. Or you might think of the acting person as not just the cause of the action incidentally, but the cause of the action as such. They're the fundamental cause of the action. Why did you wear that shirt? Because you wanted to wear that shirt, because you chose to wear that shirt. And you can provide some explanation for it. You didn't put it on, like, I remember my son one time, when he was real little, dressing himself and trying to put a pair of pants on like a shirt. He couldn't find the head hole, because of course there isn't any. And he had his arms in the pants legs, and he started crying. Because his head was stuck in the thing, right? Clearly he was acting from some sort of ignorance about the nature of pants and shirts. And it's forgivable because he was like, a year and a half old. And I was asking him to do a big thing for a kid that age, which is to put on a shirt, There's a lot of things that are done from ignorance, and we usually excuse the person. Another thing is, we say that the action is not done from compulsion. The person is not being forced, in some sense, to do the action. So when somebody is actually forced to do the action, we often don't hold them responsible. Again, think about the prisoner in the orange jumpsuit. We don't say, oh, poor fashion choice. Orange is really not your color, in part because they don't have a choice. If they want to get out of their cell and get in the truck, one second, they have to put on the orange jumpsuit, right? There's no two ways about it. Go ahead.
What if your voluntary choices in the past have led you to involuntary?
That's a very good question.
I can't really think of an example.
Well, Aristotle does talk about some of these. And this is where virtue and vice come in part. One of the things that happens with vice is the person who is vicious, they not only have a habit of doing the wrong thing, and actually this thing about providing explanations fits in with it as well. They have the wrong sort of explanations for why they're doing the wrong thing. They actually think that the right thing is what they're doing. So they're mistaken about it. They're in a state of ignorance. They may actually feel a kind of compulsion because of the force of habit too. But, and this is what Aristotle says, they're responsible for it. So your past choices make who you are currently. So if I have, as I do, if I still have a problem with temperance, and I'm willing to tell myself, stupid things like, it's okay to have ice cream before going to bed. Does that make any sense from a health perspective, from a weight loss perspective, from a perspective of self-control when it comes to food? I'll have my dessert just before I go to bed. Does that make any sense? Yet, somehow I managed to tell myself, yeah, that's reasonable. Let's go have some ice cream. Ice cream would be nice right about now. And then, have it and fall asleep, right? Why is it? Well, I made that choice. I made similar choices, not necessarily the ice cream choice, but similar choices. And when it comes to issues of bodily pleasures having to do with food, I'm poorly off. I'm more likely to make bad decisions than good decisions on the basis of at least not seeing the badness of what I'm doing for myself. I'm 40 years old. I should lose some weight. You know, I'm not going to lose weight by having ice cream before I go to bed. You know? So, yeah, you're right. There are certain choices that we make which will then condition our choices later on. And that's why virtues and vices are so important. Because a person who's virtuous, they're on the right track. They probably won't even be that tempted by the sort of situations that the rest of us find ourselves in, because they already know what the right thing is to do, and they've got a habit of doing the right thing in that respect. Go ahead.
So for someone to be able to make a proper decision voluntarily, should another stipulation be they're on a good track?
So that they're on a good track? Aristotle doesn't think so, because again, Aristotle thinks you are responsible for your virtues and vices. Now, does that mean you're completely responsible, that we all started out on a level playing field? He doesn't think that, but he thinks that at a certain point you become responsible for the kind of person that you choose to be. It could be much tougher for some people. If you're in a culture where, let's say, you're in a culture where it's expected of men that whenever they are challenged, they should fight. It's probably going to be more difficult for you to develop the virtue of genuine courage, and you're going to be much more skewed towards the vice of foolhardiness, making yourself do aggressive action in the face of fear, even when you don't really need to. Or if you could take a family situation. If your parents are particularly generous, and you see them being generous, you're probably much more likely to be generous yourself, because you take that as the norm. If they're spendthrifts, if they're constantly like blowing money and they go bankrupt a couple times, you might see that, well, no big deal. You don't see how damaging that could be to you and to the other people around you. If they're tightwads, you may see that as the norm and not be able to recognize what you're missing out on, because you haven't seen it. And that's why it's useful to have a wide range of experience, I think, from an Aristotelian perspective. Let's go to look at ignorance now. So what can you be ignorant of? A lot of things. Aristotle says there's a number of different particulars that you might be ignorant of. This is really rare, but he says that sometimes you can be ignorant of who is acting, who's actually doing the action. Like you're sleepwalking, for example, and you go into somebody's room and kick them. But you're not responsible for that, are you? Do you even know that, you were doing that? No. That's pretty rare. Usually you have to be in pretty dire circumstances for that to be an issue. What else? What you're doing. So, for example, you were entrusted with some information. You didn't realize that it was a serious situation, that the person wanted you to keep a secret, and you mentioned it to somebody else, and now that person feels humiliated, angry, all these sorts of things, and they say, you told a secret. So, I didn't know it was a secret. You didn't realize what you were doing. You thought you were doing something else. You thought you were just revealing some information, but actually you were revealing a secret. Do we have circumstances like this all the time? Sure. What you're acting on. Or whom. A really bad example of this, you get really angry with somebody, settle a score with them. And you go up to them, and it's a dark alley, and you hit them with a pipe, right? And then afterwards, this is the stuff that a lot of film noirs are made out of. Oh, it wasn't them. It was somebody else. Uh-oh, you've done a really bad thing now. In a certain sense, you did something bad. You hit somebody in the head. You shouldn't have done that. But you were intending to do something else. You were intending to do a bad action to somebody else. There could be some cases where an action that's good towards one person could be bad towards another. Couldn't there? You're a doctor, and you think that this patient sitting on your what do you call those tables? The one with the butcher paper that we sit on, the doctor's table, I guess. The person sitting on the doctor's table, you've got their chart, and you say, oh, you need an injection. I'm going to give you an injection. And you don't realize that the charts have been mixed up, and that guy's in the other room, and this injection will kill them. You don't realize that until too late. Why are you turning red? Why are you falling over? This is just a flu shot, or something like that. You don't know what you're acting on. Bless you. There could be a lot of cases like that. What else? What you're acting with. You know, the tools that you're using, the means that you're using, you could be mistaken about those. You're going to do somebody's taxes for them. You know, it's tax season now, right? And let's say you're kind of up on it, and they give you their W-2s, and you say, oh, okay, well, this is a pretty open shut thing. Do the 1040 easy. Here you go. You hand it to them. You think you're acting with the best tool, and then they come to you later on and they've got this whole box of receipts, you know, and they say, does this help out at all? And you're like, I wish you would have shown this to me a month ago, because then I would have itemized and, you know, go on through the whole thing, you know, this schedule and that schedule, and use the 1040A, I think, when you're going to itemize. You wouldn't have realized that you were carrying out something with the wrong tools, right? What if you have shoddy tools? What if you're building something and you don't realize the materials that you're building with were actually substandard? Because the store that you went to sold it to you and you thought that they were high quality. That would be a good case, wouldn't it? Say a contractor who purchased everything on the up and up, and the person that they purchased it from gave them wood that's actually not pressure treated, and then the house, you know, starts to buckle. Are they responsible for it as much as they would be if they'd known? What do you think? This could be one of those cases where you could say, well, they should have checked it. But let's say they did their due diligence. Another one could be what end you're aiming at. You don't realize what the goal actually is. Sometimes there's multiple goals in play. You think that you're just answering some questions on a questionnaire. You don't realize that this is something they're going to use to determine whether you're hired or not. They have a different goal in mind, which you don't necessarily share with them. And then there's also how one is doing the action. So, when we talk about somebody not knowing their own strength and hurting people as a result, that would be an example, wouldn't it? Or if somebody thinks that they're more dexterous than they are, let's say they're going to do something like tattooing, right? I've seen a lot of bad tattoos. Somebody did those, right? Somebody paid for those usually, or maybe they didn't pay after seeing it. And the person who was doing the tattoo, nobody comes out and says, this is going to look like crap when I'm done. You're going to hate this. Let me put it on you now. But they do it, and they don't realize they're not as good of a tattoo artist as they thought they Or that say that their hands are shaky that day. Maybe they don't realize that. Again, maybe they could be responsible for that as well. And the key thing is going to be, these can excuse a person, provided that the person themselves is not responsible for why this is the case. So if you actually came up to me and you told me, look, you're about to do this, and I want to be stubborn and say, no, I'm not doing that. I'm doing something different. I can't claim ignorance now, can I? Not the way I could if I was just raw in the situation and nobody had given me any advice. Let's think about a few examples now. Aristotle actually talks about a few which don't get us off the hook. And those that stem from vice would be an example of that. If you've actually made yourself vicious, you're responsible for the ignorance that vice includes. What about carelessness? Now this would go to some of the things you were talking about. Bless you. Not knowing the relevant laws, not paying attention to relevant aspects of the situation. There are some people who just don't pay attention to things very well. But they're the kind of person who doesn't pay attention, right? I mean, if it was because they're mentally handicapped, we wouldn't hold them as responsible as somebody who isn't. That's why we call them handicapped. They are less able to pay attention to certain things in the situation. You wouldn't expect an autistic kid to be as receptive to other people's emotional states as somebody who's not autistic, would you? That's part of what it means to be autistic, is not to be paying attention to other people's emotional states. So maybe not realizing that the words that you're choosing, what you're acting with, will hurt somebody's feelings. You know, or maybe not realizing this is a common issue with autistic people. Quite often can get very fixated on material aspects of their environment. They can see patterns. They can pay attention to things that the rest of us can't pay as much attention to as well. So, you know, like the patterns in the floor tiles, for example. We just don't pay any attention to it unless we're staring at it and we start seeing there's some regularities there. Sometimes people get fascinated with those and they take figuring out the pattern is what's really important, not paying attention to the other people in the situation. That could be a state of ignorance for Aristotle that could excuse behavior. Would it excuse behavior for me? Probably not. Because I can pay attention to how other people feel or what their experience is like. Actions done in anger are kind of a tricky one. That's a hard one to draw the lines with. And maybe it's better to put that one off until next class session. Actions done while drunk. Aristotle talks about this very quickly. He says, hey, if you chose to get drunk, you chose to put yourself in that state of ignorance. Sort of like if you go around, let's say, remember how, when you're a kid, you guys like piñatas? Yes? No? They're full of candy. That's the best thing about it. And you get to whack them. But they put the blindfold on you, right? And there's kind of a danger with that, isn't there? Because especially the younger the kids are, as soon as you put that blindfold on, they start swinging, they might hit the adult. You have to actually steer them over to the piñata and get them to swing around. Well, imagine now you did that as an adult. You had a stick, you put on a blindfold, and you start walking around, whacking at things. You're responsible for that, right? You chose to put that blindfold on. That's the way Aristotle would look at something like, say, getting drunk, or you could think about the effects of various drugs. That's actually a good example to use for ignorance. Not necessarily the being on drugs, but think about why people use drugs. Do we hold them responsible for drug use? We often say that's voluntary. Why? Couldn't there be situations where maybe it's not voluntary?
Well, it's your choice to start it, but then eventually once you're addicted, I think that's when it stops being a choice and becomes a necessity.
Yeah. Now that would seem to have more to do with compulsion, although there could be a component of ignorance. And don't people who are hooked on drugs often tell themselves convenient lies about their own condition? Like, I can quit anytime I want. It's not really that addictive. What else? What else could fit into, what mistaken beliefs could one have that would lead one to start using hard drugs? You know, like say crack or crystal meth or heroin or PCP. You know, the stuff that will really ruin your life. Did you have health class when you were in elementary school or middle school and high school? They have stuff on drugs in that. Maybe you had to watch movies. Little Johnny, you know, takes a hit off the joint, and now he's addicted, and then he becomes a crack addict, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Peer pressure.
Yeah.
People asking you surrounding areas, making you think you don't really have a choice. You're kind of just.
Yeah, and I think that there's an element of compulsion to that. But I think there's also, at a certain point, kind of an ignorance that can stem from that. If everybody around you is saying this is the thing to do, and some film strip that you watch, you know, and some teacher that you see every once in a while in school is telling you, no, this is not a good thing for you to do, it's hard to make that knowledge actual, isn't it? When everybody else around you, let's say your parents are, you know, every once in a while shooting heroin. They probably wouldn't be very good parents if they did, but imagine you wouldn't have much in your house because they'd have to sell most of it. But let's say other people are doing that. So it doesn't really affect me that much. It's not going to ruin your life. It feels really good. That's one reason people start drugs, isn't it? Sometimes they don't know what the effects are. Sometimes people end up trying one drug and they don't realize they're trying another because drugs are cut with other drugs. You know, somebody who's a pot smoker gets handed a joint that contains PCP. They may not have put themselves in for that. You know, one is fairly mild drug, the other one's pretty hardcore. You know, let's say we talk about another one, another type of. Another case of ignorance. Think about plagiarism. You guys all hear about plagiarism all the time, right? What is plagiarism? You can probably rattle off a definition for me right off the top of your head. When do students plagiarize, in your experience? Not you, but other students that you know. When do they plagiarize?
I feel like it's typically by accident, like you'll be quoting stuff that you read or like thinking it's your own idea and it turns out like an author had the same idea. I mean, I've never done it, but I've heard people get in trouble for it without meaning to.
Well, I mean, I said exactly the same words as Aristotle.
Not the exact
That's hard
same
to
words.
do, but
Paraphrasing.
yeah, sometimes people forget to put the references in. If you're writing a very long paper and there's a long process, you can sometimes forget these things. Sometimes students are actually unaware. It's kind of hard to see how this could be the case, but sometimes they're unaware of what actually constitutes plagiarism. Probably not so much here, but at lower tier schools. And you know, we try to combat that by putting in statements about it. But unless you actually explain it to students, a lot of students don't grasp the concept of plagiarism right away, do they? I mean, we have to do some work, yeah.
This is just a question. I haven't really thought about it before. Like, as students, when we send something to you, and let's say you turn it in.com,
Yeah.
We're punished if we're pretty severely if something comes up and it's a significant portion. Maybe, like Elizabeth said, we just forgot.
Yeah.
But if in a professional level, can somebody turn it in as like a tool to check themselves, to double check, and
Yes.
not get in trouble, and use it as a double checking point? Is there any way that like we as students can do that? So
I don't know
we
how
don't
you
shoot ourselves in the foot.
I don't know how that would work
by mistake.
that way, but there would be one problem with it I can think of offhand. I don't know if you realize this. Every time that you submit something to turnitin.com,
It then becomes.
that goes into the
Yeah.
database.
Yeah.
So if you were to submit,
It is second.
that's why I don't have your rough draft as part of Turnitin, because otherwise I'd get all these false positives, right? So if you were to submit your work to check it, and then you were to submit another later version of it, and your instructor is kind of careless, because it actually tells us what similarities there are. So it should say, you know, so-and-so's essay, but it may not do that. Or the instructor may not look, they just say, oh, 31% F, you know. You would be putting yourself at a disadvantage by using Turnitin that way. I don't know how you would do it anyway, though. I'm not a big fan of Turnitin. I do use it because we're supposed to use it for the final paper. But, it's kind of a blunt club.
Yeah.
I think I mean, we could actually talk about, in some respects, let's say we flip the plagiarism thing, are instructors responsible for understanding what Turnitin is actually telling us? Let's say I don't pay much attention to it. I just say, okay, anybody who's got above a 25, you've got an automatic F. You've got above a 25, automatic F. But it turns out that what Turnitin will actually tell us is 1% is from this, another 2% from this. It's not like 25% all came from one single source. But let's say I think that, in part because I don't know the way Turnitin works. So that would be what you're acting with. Am I responsible for that? Maybe if I'm a grad student fresh out of college and I'm teaching my 4 classes and nobody's mentored me or anything like that, maybe I can say, oh, I didn't know. But if I've been teaching for 10 years and I've used Turnitin before and I've been at multiple institutions and we've had workshops on Turnitin.com, there's no way I can claim ignorance then, can I? I am ignorant, but whose fault is it? It's my own fault, which means that I'm then responsible. One other example that I want to use for ignorance before we look at compulsion, going to college itself. One of the places that I taught before, it was a very low-tier school, which means that they were taking in students who were very unprepared for college. And a lot of these students were first-generation college students from fairly poor neighborhoods, and they had the impression that if they just got into college, they'd made it. They were now on the way, and they were going to be doctors and lawyers, and pick whatever else you want to be. They were very unrealistic about their prospects, about the amount of work ahead of them. And in my classes that I was teaching basic level critical thinking classes where we would thematize this specifically. I would say to them, look, if you think that going to college is going to cut it, it's not. You actually have to graduate from college. And at that place that I taught, the last year that I taught there had a 7% 4-year graduation rate. That means 100 students coming in, only 7 of them would graduate in 4 years, 30% of them after 6 years. So half of the students coming in wouldn't even graduate. And part of the reason why they did that, they didn't realize that it's not enough to go to college, you have to have a degree. And then, some of those who graduated, they sort of skated by, and it was an easy school. And they, they picked classes that were going to be fairly easy, and then they'd think they were going to go to med school. Or they were going to get hired by IBM or Apple or something like that. It doesn't work that way. You actually have to have skills that you can demonstrate, a portfolio. You have to have a grade point average, right? You guys know this because this is sort of common knowledge. They didn't realize that. And again, this goes to that question of culpability. If nobody explained that to them, were they responsible for that? Probably not. After they made it through my class, they couldn't claim ignorance anymore. They were now responsible, and so if they sloughed off and just made it through, and they were part of that 7% who graduated in 4 years, but they didn't acquire any skills that employers want, and nobody wants to hire them, they're responsible for that condition. They can't claim ignorance at that point, can they? Let's go now to consider ignorance. Aristotle talks about a number of things we can be ignorant of. He says that we can be ignorant of who the agent is, who's actually acting. That's pretty rare, but when people are totally out of their heads, maybe they don't realize that they're doing certain things. What somebody's doing. This is a lot more common. It's possible to be unaware of what you're doing or to mistake it for being something else, right? You tell somebody some information that you have, you didn't realize that you were actually giving away a secret. So how would you describe your action? You would describe your action originally as just, I'm just sharing some information. I'm just filling somebody in. You didn't realize you were supposed to keep that information confidential. You did something wrong. Are you responsible then? If you didn't know, are you responsible? What do you think? Let's say it's not a case where you're obliged to hold on to confidential information, like where you've actually signed an agreement, or you know the ins and outs of it. Or think about, for example, FERPA, right? You guys all know what FERPA stands for, I think? Or you don't know what it stands for, because none of us do. You know what it means for you, right? What does it mean for you as a student? Ask any professor, by the way, what FERPA means, and you'll get like family something information, blah,
Isn't it to protect us from anyone else seeing our grades?
That's one part of it. Nobody who belongs to this institution is supposed to provide other information about you, including grades, class performance, images of you, things that you've written, without having some sort of good reason to do so or having permission from you. So if your parents, for example, are concerned about your grades and they write me, what I have to say to them is, I can't tell you that information. I have to get permission from your son or daughter in order to release that information to you. When at the beginning of the semester, when I had you sign that waiver so that we could record this video, you guys aren't even in the video, but your voices are. I have to get permission from each one of you in order to be able to film these things, right? Because otherwise I'd be violating, in a certain sense, your privacy. You have an expectation of privacy. It wasn't like that, by the way, back when I was a student. Parents could get your grades, which had bad effects sometimes for students. Bless you. Now, if I try to claim, well, I didn't know I couldn't give away your grades. Your mom writes me. I didn't know I couldn't give away his grades. Will that fly? No, because I'm responsible for my state of ignorance in that case. But if I didn't know, let's say we're not professor student, we're just people that know each other from the street, and I say, yeah, he's doing pretty good in school. I talked to somebody in his ethics class, and they said he's got, he contributes in class and seems to know what's going on. I wouldn't be violating your FERPA rights then, and I wouldn't be responsible for divulging the information. So what somebody's doing, you can often mistake what you're actually up to. What or whom one is acting on. For instance, you could think that your own child is a home invader. That's one of the examples I used in Highland. These sort of cases happen sometimes, right? You give money to somebody who you believe is a good person to do good things. Turns out that they're a crook. Are you responsible for that? Well, you didn't know, did you, right? What you're acting with. Aristotle has this great example that you probably remember from Hamlet of having a practice sword and not really realizing that it's a real sword. That the practice tip that you're going to thrust into somebody, there's a hard point on that. So you stick it into somebody. Did you mean to do that? Was that your intention? You're not responsible for it then, in a sense. It's involuntary. What end you're aiming at? You may not have the same end as other people within the situation. I have this example of, you might take a test not realizing that that test determines whether you get hired or not. You just think you're taking a test, so you're going to try to do okay on the test. You don't realize that you shouldn't answer certain questions certain ways. things. You think if you're just being honest, you don't realize that maybe it's screening out certain types of things. How one is doing the action. When we talk about somebody not knowing their own strength, this would be that sort of thing, right? Somebody, well, you see this, for example, when people, some people, end up injuring babies. You got to handle babies pretty carefully, right? Matter of fact, some people, you hand them a baby and they're like all shaky because they're afraid that it's going to crack like an egg. Other people don't realize that you can't just like, a baby's not like a stuffed animal. You can't just sit it down and then walk away, can you? What's going to happen? Within like a minute, kid's going to fall over until it's, you know, the age where it sits up and they sit up like this a little bit at first and then they get a little bit more steady. But if you take a little baby and you just stick it there somewhere, it's going to fall over. It's not like a doll. Well, you know, does everybody know that sort of thing? Not always, right? So there could be some cases where ignorance is actually causing the doer to commit the action. Or I suppose you could have emotional responses as well. Have any of you ever gotten angry with somebody when you really didn't have good cause to get angry with them because you thought they were saying something that they really weren't saying? That could have been ignorance, right? Now, Aristotle is not willing to say that whenever you're ignorant of things, that you're off the hook. There could be some cases, I'll use the dotted line here, where you yourself could be responsible for that state of ignorance. Right? So he's got the example for. So let's look at some examples. You're out driving, and you're blind drunk, and you hit a pedestrian. You didn't see them, right? Because you're not actually seeing anything. You have double vision. You don't even realize how drunk you are. And you plow into a pedestrian. You don't realize that you were driving on the sidewalk rather than the road. So that's clearly a case of ignorance, right? So it's not your fault, is it? We don't say that legally, do we? Aristotle was struggling with the same sort of problem as we do in our own time. If you're ignorant of the situation that you're in, because you've gotten yourself so drunk that you can't tell where you are or what you're doing, you're responsible for that state of ignorance, aren't you? So Aristotle says, he's noting, in ancient Greek cities, quite often they doubled the penalty if you were drunk when you committed the crime. In part because they had so much problem with people committing crimes while they were drunk and then saying, I didn't realize what was going on, I was drunk. Or, you know, you get in a bar fight with somebody because you're drunk and you misheard what they said and your impulse control is kind of low. Well, you know, again, nobody forced you to drink all those beers or whiskeys or whatever it is that you like. So in a sense, you become responsible for them. What might be some cases where you're not responsible? What if somebody deliberately lies to you? What if somebody deliberately places you in a condition of ignorance? Are you responsible then? I guess if you could say that you would still have some reasonable way of figuring out whether they were lying to you, maybe you could say that you're responsible for it. But think about a really good con man. They usually cover every base, right? When people get taken in. For instance, let's say we look at the difference between, all of you get those Nigerian, what do they call that scam? The Nigerian bank scam? Where sometimes it's Egyptian, sometimes it's Russian, sometimes it's from other places. Somebody emails you out of the blue and they say, I really need to move $10 million out of my country. I'd like to put it in your bank account for a little while. I'll let you have $1 million of it. You just got to give me your bank account number. Sound familiar? You guys get emails like that, don't you? Well, you don't get those scam things? I still get them every so often. By this point, if you don't know that to be a scam, you're probably responsible. What if you're an 80-year-old person who just started using the internet? Are you as responsible, you think? Maybe not. What if they follow it up and they don't do these, unsophisticated things where it's actually misspelled and, the information is hardly credible. But it's somebody who comes to you door to door and they talk with you and you get to know this person, and now they want to carry out a financial transaction that could be really lucrative for you. But you have to make yourself vulnerable to that person in some way financially. They get to use your credit card, or they get to use your name to buy something. They seem very credible, though. You check them out. You actually go online and use Rodaris or something like that to see whether there's any records of them. And they seem perfectly legitimate. Now you get scammed. And you spent all of your life savings on this. Is that your fault? Aristotle would probably say no. Again, there's going to be a lot of situational factors involved with this. What about things that stem from our habits? If we have bad habits, that can often produce a state of ignorance, can't it? If we're vicious people, if we actually think, here's what makes a vicious person. They think that bad things are good. So the coward, what a real coward is somebody who actually thinks that cowardice is the norm, that everybody else is crazy for acting, for standing up for themselves. What makes a stingy person who actually has that vice of stinginess, a stingy person, is they believe that that's the rational thing to do, that that's the best thing to do. They ought to be stingy. They ought not to give other people things, and they ought to try to take as much as possible. Now, if somebody has that sort of mindset, would you say that they're in a state of ignorance? Ignorance about, facts of the case, or ignorance about moral realities? Like, is it a good thing to give people generously? Or is it a good thing to always hold on to everything and never give anybody anything? They actually believe that it's a good thing not to give anybody anything. Maybe they have associated with this some things like, it's a tough world out there, nobody's going to give you a break. They have a whole mindset with this. Does that get them off the hook? Do we say, oh, they can't help themselves? They're not a bad person. They're just a stingy person. Or do we criticize them? Do we blame them? Aristotle says we blame them. And the reason is, they have made themselves that way. By choosing to be stingy over and over again. Nobody actually starts out vicious. People become vicious. They come to have a skewed sense of moral realities, in part because they've chosen to do that over and over again. They've been in situations where they could have given generously, and they chose the opposite, and eventually they come to convince themselves that that's the right thing to do. Likewise, say an angry person, a person who loses their temper all the time. You think about people that you know in your life. Don't a lot of angry people who lose their temper all the time tell themselves that that's the right thing to do, that they're just standing up for themselves? Everybody else should do the same thing in their situations. Well, that's probably a sign that they're vicious, and they're in a state of ignorance. But how did they get to be that way? They chose to give into that anger over and over again. And on some level, they chose to buy into the justifications. And the longer that you do it, the more that you do it, the easier it gets to be to justify these things. The first time that you do something wrong, that you want to justify it to yourself, did it work really well? When you're think back to when you were a kid, did something bad, you knew it was bad. After you did it, you started to feel some remorse, and then you told yourself, it was okay for me to do that. Did you buy it the first time that you said that to yourself? Did you still feel bad when you did it? Or after you did it? Now imagine you do that over and over and over again. It gets easier and easier, doesn't it? When you lie to yourself about basic things about yourself, right and wrong, it's sort of like, changing a pattern. Eventually you change from one pattern to a different pattern. And so this is a good place actually to go away from these examples about ignorance and think about virtue and vice or choice. Aristotle says that we, in addition to the voluntary and the involuntary, which we can actually even attribute to children, there is the realm of the chosen, deliberate choice. And this is a little bit more restrictive. You might think of what he's calling choice as character-forming choice or habit-forming choice. He uses this term proiresis, which literally means to choose one thing instead of another. So choosing to be a courageous person rather than to be a cowardly person, or choosing to be a courageous person rather than choosing to be a foolhardy person. So he says, proiresis, or choice, ultimately involves something that he calls deliberation. We think about what our goals are. When we do this, we've talked about this a lot this semester, right? We think about our goals in immediate situations, like your goal is to finish this class, graduate from Marist, get a job and all that. Why do you want to do that? Remember a couple classes ago? Just for its own sake? You just went to college, just, to go to college? Yeah.
Be able to have and provide for a family and give back to the community.
Yeah, you guys were able to come up with a whole bunch of reasons. Maybe you're a little burnt out. When we engage in deliberate choice, we're thinking about those bigger ends. So we form ourselves. We make ourselves into certain kinds of people depending on what we take as our main end. If you take wealth as your main end, you're more likely to end up being stingy, right? Than being generous. If, on the other hand, you think that providing for your family is an important thing, you're probably going to have a much more measured attitude towards money. And then when it comes to your kids coming to you and saying, we'll use the Xbox example. Dad, I'd like an Xbox, and they actually make some sort of reasoned appeal. Xbox. Or no, use PlayStation. Sorry. You can actually say, yeah, okay, that seems like a reasonable expense for the amount of pleasure that you're going to get out of it. Let's go out to the store and get it. Rather than saying, we don't spend money in this house. That will form who you are. Those sort of choices made over and over again are going to form the kind of person that you are. So, again, people don't start out fair or unfair. We all start out with certain propensities, but then we build on them by the choices that we make. And we often have to think about these. We have to deliberate. One of the things that comes into deliberation quite often is, what kind of person do I want to be? Do I want to be the kind of person who does good things, or do I want to be the kind of person who says, I'm going to do whatever I want to, which will eventually become, doing vicious things sooner or later, if you don't set down some sort of limits of that. We said just a minute ago that there's two ways to think of compulsion. One would be to think of some sort of external force being applied, maybe physical, maybe psychological. Another way to think of it is some sort of psychological. Nobody's physically doing something inside of you, right? To use that example, what would be something that you have felt a compulsion about getting your parents to buy you in a store? Maybe not, this last week, but sometime.
When I was little, I wanted, or not little, but I wanted PlayStation 2 really bad.
Oh, that's understandable.
And
Kids really want that sort of thing. Actually, commercials are set up to make kids desire things. I think you guys know this, right? That's why they had, remember when you had cartoons, and then almost immediately after the cartoon, there'd be like the action figures for that cartoon. They want you to get your parents to get it. Some sort of psychological desire or force. And would you say that force is outside of you? It's inside, right? That's where you feel it. So we can talk about an external force applied to you in some way, and we can talk about some internal force, some compulsion. Now, Aristotle has a few other examples. So he talks, he's using examples from his own time. He talks about somebody who's sailing and the wind blows him to a port that he doesn't want to be in. He didn't choose to end up there, right? The wind pushed him that direction. That's compulsion. That's an external force. Another person grabbing a person's hand, smacking them, we just brought that up. That's an example of compulsion. If I had some sort of box that let me, well, let's say it's like a PlayStation, right? Has some sort of controller that let me control all of your movements because there was a chip in the back of your head. Would you be responsible for your movements in that case? I would be responsible for it. I would be the one who's making you do the things that you do. Now notice, in each of these cases, we do have the same sort of pattern where there's some sort of action, something that happens, and then there's the person doing the action, but then we say that there's some sort of force making the person do the action. And the reason why we say, in the case of compulsion, that the person is not actually responsible for their actions is because we trace back the causality, as we say, the chain of cause and effect to whatever it was that forced the hand. So if it's the wind that blew you off course, you were sailing, you wanted to get to, I don't know, where would you sail to around here? I don't know about the Great Lakes, but you wanted to sail to Florida, and you wound up in the Bahamas instead. The wind was responsible, right? You didn't choose that. If I grab your hand and I smack somebody else, or I have some other way of making your body do certain things, you're not responsible for that action. I'm responsible for it. It gets a little bit more interesting when we think about emotions, because remember Aristotle talked about virtues and vices having to do with emotions, right? Responses. When somebody makes you angry, have all of you been so angry that you've done things that you regretted later? And sometimes you realized, yeah, that was me. I could have chosen not to do that, but I did do it. And other times you actually felt like you couldn't possibly not do that. Some of you may have to go back to when you were kids in order to recall instances like that, if you've developed good control over your anger. Some of you may only have to think about last week, right? We would often say, well, it's the person who angered me who is really responsible for all of this. Aristotle's actually kind of receptive to that. He thinks there's certain things that you ought to get angry about. And so if you are angry, it could be the cause, it could be because somebody else thoughtlessly or deliberately provoked you. Aristotle says we get angry quite often when people put us down. There's a verb that means to look down upon other people. So quite often when you get angry, it's because you feel that somebody else is devaluing you they're treating you in a way that you don't like to be treated, in a way that you probably think they wouldn't like to be treated as well. If we want to say that compulsion is involved in that case, we would actually have to say that this person is responsible, the angering person. Like, for example, let's think about a determinate case. Bullying, right? We've used this as an example a few times because it's a topic that's in the news. What happens with kids that are bullied, typically? Does it produce any changes in them over time? What kind of changes? What happens to them? Yeah.
It usually affects their confidence level and their self-respect and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think you're right. In most cases, the kids that are being bullied don't end up fighting back, do they?
No.
They end up, you might say, succumbing to bullying. And we've used this as an example when we're talking about courage. One second. So if we want to talk about the person becoming more and more vulnerable, less and less able to resist the bullying, and we want to look at that as a kind of course of action, and we say, are they responsible for that? Because their parents might say, hey, just buck up, you know, stand up for yourself. You know, you're responsible for this case. And oftentimes the victims get blamed too, don't they? In that case, we would be saying that that person is fully responsible, and we'd be ignoring the back end of this. Why are they faced with that situation in the first place? Because somebody's bullying them. Usually it's not just one person bullying them, right? How does it actually work in, you guys are, 3 years out of high school. How does it work in middle school and high school? Is the kid who's bullied only bullied by one person usually? What's it like? Once somebody starts getting bullied, what happens to them? Maybe your high school is very different than my high school. Yeah.
Well, unless they have some really good way to come back at you, then they should become an easy target for everyone.
Yeah, once, in situations where we use this kind of, I don't want to say necessarily violence, although it could involve physical violence, but intimidation, tearing people down, that sort of thing. Once somebody doesn't fight back, other people who want to do that sort of thing see them as an easy mark, and they'll do it now too, and that makes it even worse, right? It intensifies it. Who are you gonna?
Well, sometimes the victims here just ignore them, don't react to the stuff.
Sometimes, yeah. And does that?
Maybe
Does that work very well?
Sometimes they're not fighting back because they're kind of holding on to false hope that they keep ignoring them. Eventually they'll move on to someone else.
Yeah, and sometimes parents will say stuff to you like, don't give them the satisfaction of making you angry, right? Or don't let them know that it's getting to you, and then they'll leave you alone. And sometimes I suppose that works. In my experience, I've never actually seen it work, but I suppose there's cases where it does. The person's state after a while, how voluntary is that? How voluntary is the condition that they're placed in of being the mark? In one sense, we might say, well, if they don't fight back, they're responsible for the situation that they're in. But again, I think that's ignoring the fact that there's another person in here, or people, who are actually choosing to hurt that other person, the person who's being bullied, choosing to tear them down, anticipating their responses, right? When the person does, for example, say, ignore them, then what do? They act some more, don't they? Or they use that against them. They call them different names. In a sense, I think Aristotle might be receptive to this. He would say the sort of things that we experience with bullying are more the responsibility of the person who's doing the bullying than the person who's being bullied. That, in a sense, it's kind of, there's something morally wrong, morally off with blaming the victim in these kind of cases. What about cases where the bullied person fights back? How does that often go? I mean, sometimes it's fairly measured. I think you've all seen that internet video where that big kid was getting bullied by this little kid, and then he punches him, and the little kid just, like crumples because it was a big kid who hit him. But he was being bullied for day after day after day after day. Does he go over there and start, stomping him or anything like that? He doesn't. He stops, right? Is that always how bullied kids react when they finally quit taking it? I remember a kid when I was in middle school, and we were playing baseball, and I don't know what happened. It was one of those sort of things where somebody, one of the mean kids got an idea, and then like everybody ended up joining in. And the kid was wearing a jacket. Everybody started spitting on his back. One person did it, and then he'd turn around, and then another person would do it from behind, and the kid's getting madder and madder. This kid had been picked on and bullied for at least a semester or so. He was a transfer student. They're always easier marks. And finally, he started to he's knock it off. You start seeing his face get red. You could tell he was getting more and more agitated. Understandably so, right? Would any of you like to have that happen to you? And you tell somebody to knock it off, and then the next guy behind you does that, and then you turn around to him and somebody else does it. That would infuriate you after a while. Well, he ended up picking up a baseball bat, and if he had connected, I think he probably would have killed the kid, because he was swinging, pretty hard. He was, in a fury, and luckily he didn't connect. Whose fault would it have been if he actually did? That's worth thinking about. Yeah.
Is it a safe assumption to say both are false?
Aristotle might be willing to say, in a case like that it's actually the fault of those who are doing the angry. And oftentimes in law,
They didn't pick up the bat and hit themselves.
that's right. And you could say that in a sense he's responsible, in a sense they're responsible. Aristotle's also receptive to that. But the more that it becomes something like somebody else calling the shots, somebody else forcing the situation, the less responsible the agent becomes. Now, if somebody had just, mouthed off to him and somebody picks up a bat and starts hitting people, Aristotle would say that's not a sufficient provocation to count as compulsion. What were you going to say?
I feel like I feel like the emotion of anger isn't his fault at all. The action is, I feel like it's more understandable, like you can reason why he did it, but I don't necessarily think it was still his choice, the action.
Well, Aristotle is willing to say that there are some psychological pressures that, as he calls it, overstrain human nature. So there would be some people, say for instance we took Gandhi, right, and did this to Gandhi. Gandhi wouldn't pick up the baseball bat, right? But Gandhi is, this incredibly disciplined person who, developed this habit of nonviolence. And it took a lot of work to do that. As a matter of fact, he writes about being angry and wanting to strike back early on in his career, and then he has to realize that. This kid was, 12 years old. Doesn't fully have impulse control developed. Everybody's picking on him. They've been picking on him for a while. I don't know. This is one of, very often these are kind of hard cases. I think could we at least agree that the bullies bear more responsibility for how the things go than he does? Now, if it had been a different sort of situation, if this kid had deliberated about it and said, "What can I do to send a message to these other kids not to do it?" then I think we probably would say, yeah, now he's more responsible. Like, think back to when you were very young, the Columbine shootings. Those kids, they formed a plan. They were being bullied. They felt, a lot of pain, anguish, anger, psychological pressure. But that didn't mean that they actually had to go out and get trench coats and guns and make a plan to go into the school and shoot it up, right? I think it's in some way different than somebody just picking up a bat that's handy and starting to swing. And Aristotle's not saying any of these are good things. He's not saying everything's okay. He's interested in tracing out who's ultimately responsible. Let's look at a few other examples that have to do with compulsion. He talks about acting out of fear. And here Aristotle is, again, a bit less receptive to saying, well, it's entirely the fault of the person who made the other person afraid. If I threaten you, I'm going to give you an F in this class unless you do what? Report to me on the habits of your classmate. You're going to follow your classmate around, shadow them, and then write me a 5-page report at the end of the semester. I'm going to count that instead of your final paper, right? If you don't do it, get an F. Do you have a choice in the matter? Hey, let's say you do it. You follow your classmate around, and then they ask you, "What are you doing? Why are you following me around? Why are you taking notes on me?" "I'm going to write a report for Dr. Sadler." "Why are you doing that?" "Well, he said that if I don't do this, I'm going to get an F." And they say, "Oh, that's okay then. Violate my privacy all you like. That's A-okay, because you were under compulsion." Yeah.
What about like acting out of like the fear of God?
Like that, you'll go to hell if you...
Right, you're supposed to do the right thing because otherwise you go to hell. Is that then, do you get less credit for being a good person if you do good things only because of that?
Well, from Aristotle's perspective, he never talks about this as far as I can tell, because he doesn't really focus much on the Greek religion. In general, yes, that would be a less praiseworthy motive. It would just be a type of punishment, right? It's displacing the punishment to the afterworld instead of in this life. It's sort of like saying, I'm going to not shoplift because I don't like when I go to jail. You shouldn't shoplift in part because it's a bad thing to do, and you can recognize the badness, and you can, say, value your relationship with the storekeeper and all these other things. There could be better motives than that. Let's say we change it a little bit. Let's say somebody is a very religious person, but they haven't done a lot of thinking about religion, and they're very prone to accept what authorities have to say. Because when you get into, this is a sort of side note, when you get into the theology of who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, it gets pretty complicated and murky, right? It's not so absolutely cut and dried as some people would like it to make it out to be. And this is what a lot of the great theologians in the Christian tradition have said to us, like Thomas Aquinas. Well, let's say you've got a person who's fairly susceptible to taking for granted whatever authorities say. So if some religious authority says to this person, if you don't go kill that other person, you're going to hell. That person is an abomination. They are doing horrible things. Maybe they even throw some lies in. They've desecrated this religious area over here. They've raped, killed, murdered, stolen, all these sorts of things. And if you don't kill them, you're going to hell because you're just as bad as them. People make these sort of arguments at times. Or let's say they offer you the prospect of, well, if you kill this person, you're going to heaven. I suppose that Aristotle would be willing to say that if this person is of the sort that readily believes that sort of thing, that the other person would be more responsible. Let's say they belong to an environment where this is the norm. Then they would be less responsible for their action. Less responsible, I don't think he would say entirely unresponsible. And this one would actually tie in a little bit more with ignorance, I think, too. There's certain things about which we really ought not to be ignorant, Aristotle thinks. We'll get to that in just one second. I want to think of one other example of compulsion that we could talk about. So acting out of fear of some bad consequence if one doesn't act that way. Aristotle says you do have some choice. So let's say we're at the ATM, I come up behind you, it's a dark night, and I've got a knife, and I say, take out whatever, I forget what the limit is, for ATMs these days, but take it out. I'm robbing you. You could, you do have some measure of choice, right? You could say, screw you, I'm going to do whatever I want. I'm not going to give you my money. You could do that, right? You could give me money too, bless you. There's other things you could do too, like you could, pretend like you're so nervous that you drop the card and you can't remember the combination. There might be other things that you could do. But let's say I say, if you don't remember the combination, I'm going to kill you. You better figure it out right away. So I reduce it to a yes-no choice, yeah.
I've heard that, just in case this ever happens to anyone, that if you punch in your PIN backwards, it will give you your money, but it will also
like trace it?
or something, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. That's worth checking up on, actually, just in case it should ever happen. Because that's one of those sort of bits of knowledge that unless you had it sort of handy, you wouldn't remember to do that in a scary situation. How many of you do you think would actually say to the robber, I'm not going to do what you want? Probably not too many, right? If you did, why would you do it? I mean, I knew somebody once who actually did something like that. She was robbed in Milwaukee, in a bad part of Milwaukee, and this kid wanted her wallet. Kid had a knife, and she said, "I'm not going to give you the wallet. I'll give you the money because you can use that, but I'm not giving you the credit cards, and I'm not giving you the rest of the wallet because it's got all my ID in it. And it takes a long time to get new IDs, and it's a big pain if you don't have any IDs, and all of mine are in here. And I'm not giving you the credit cards, because the first thing I would do is cancel them anyway, and I'm not going through the process of having to void the cards, wait for new cards to show up, particularly if I don't have any ID. I'll give you the money. I'll give you," and she had like $80. "I'll give you the $80. And she was very nervous when she did this, of course. She was feeling fear, right? Because somebody was trying to compel her. She said the kid was actually kind of nervous as well. But imagine a hardened robber, right? Somebody who's not, 16 years old, but 30 years old and has done this, dozens of times. That takes a lot of guts. That is possible to do, though. It's difficult. And Aristotle would say there's no hard and fast line here. Again, we run into that situation of, does it overstrain human nature? How much would your sense of fear sort of flood over you and force you to do that sort of stuff? If you had been through the military, do you think it would be easier for you to face that sort of situation? You've been through boot camp, or basic training, or whatever the Air Force calls it. I don't know what they call it. We often used to make fun of them because we thought their training wasn't quite up to snuff. It would probably be easier, and you would be more responsible for your actions in that situation. If you were some 18-year-old kid on campus for the first time, never been outside of your hometown, which was a small hometown, now you're in a big city, and suddenly you're being mugged, are you as responsible for your behavior in giving the money? Probably not, right? You have much less control over that. Let's look now at compulsion. When you hear this word compulsion, what do you think of? Ignorance is not knowing things, right? What is compulsion? Yeah.
It's like acting without thinking.
Well, that would be more ignorance, wouldn't it? Yeah.
You're curious about the effect.
Are you curious about the effect? I suppose if curiosity itself becomes a compulsion for you, like some people just can't help themselves, they can't tear themselves away from looking at the road crash or something like that. Now we're starting to get towards one meaning of compulsion, yeah.
Like a lack of control.
Okay, so it could be lack of control over what?
Over
Or in the face of
your
what?
actions,
Over your actions. What's doing the controlling
confusion.
then? Okay, so and this would go to the curiosity thing. We often use this in describing situations of temptation. And what's tempting us? What do we attribute that to? Curiosity could be a desire that you find hard to resist. What else? What tempts you? Ice cream tempts me, before bedtime. We just talked about that one, right? Did the ice cream make me eat it? Call out to me, Greg Sadler, I've got something tasty for you. Come to the refrigerator, scoop me out. Yeah.
Things that offer you pleasure and,
Okay.
or otherwise avoiding pain.
Yeah, I think Aristotle thinks that a lot of this is pleasures and avoiding pains. We might be able to bring curiosity under that rubric. There's a certain pleasure in knowing that we seek when we're doing something, especially things that we don't have a right to know about, right? That's when we get in trouble. And so there's some sort of drive or temptation or desire, and we often feel that it's overpowering us. It's making us do things. Maybe our emotions too, right? Those are things inside of us, so we usually say, right? They could be outside, the imaginary ice cream thing. Pick whatever food you want. Imagine kind of a cartoon thing, and it's like pushing the refrigerator open and peeking around the corner and saying, "Come sample me, I'm tasty," right? It's external to me, but my desires are inside of me. My desires are what are being provoked by the external object. What else makes us feel compelled? Yeah.
Definitely peer pressure.
Okay, psychological force, and we can talk about some sort of external force. Could be psychological, or it could actually be physical. Aristotle uses the example of if I grab your hand and I whack somebody else in the face with it, you didn't actually willingly whack somebody in the face. Matter of fact, you may be very surprised, Imagine like a situation like this. Somebody's laying on a massage table, they're getting a massage, and then somebody takes their hand, and there's somebody, sitting next to them. They have to be sitting in order to make it work, and they just whack them right in the face. And they're like, what was that? You say, "Oh, I'm sorry," but you're less sorry that you did it, that your hand did it. You're more sorry that you were used as an instrument, right? Maybe you'll actually feel a little bad, like I should have resisted. But you didn't know, did you? That person was going to do that? Or even, let's say they did know that. Let's say somebody's much stronger than you, and they've got you, they're holding your wrist, and they whack somebody else with your body. You're not responsible for that, are you? What if they had like a little thing inside your brain that made you do certain things? Again, we wouldn't say you're responsible, would we? If there's some external force. And sometimes that external force can be psychological. Peer pressure can be difficult to resist. Aristotle is willing to talk about certain things which, as he puts it, overcome human nature, overmaster human nature. There's some things where, not everybody, but most people will find themselves unable to actually resist them. I'm trying to find that actual quote, because it's a good one. overstrains human nature. That's the term that he uses. Different emotions can do that. Fear. So let's end there. Have a good break. Have a good Easter. We'll pick up with actual virtues and vices when you guys come back next Tuesday.